talk to the project. Since the device of unequal action seems promising as a technique for achieving an attractive interpretation of equality of resources in a simple context, like the desert island, the question arises whether it will prove useful in developing a more general account of the idea. We should ask whether the device could be elaborated to provide a scheme for developing or testing equality of resources in a community that has a dynamic economy with labor, investment, and trade. What structure must an auction take in such an economy? What adjustments or supplements may be made to the production and trade that would follow such an auction in order that the results continue to satisfy our initial requirement that an equal share of the resources be available to each citizen? Our interest in this question is threefold. First, the project provides an important test of the coherence and completeness of the idea of equality of resources. Suppose no auction or pattern of post-auction trade could be described whose results could be accepted as equality in any society much more complex or less artificial than a simple economy of consumption, or that no action could produce equality without constraints and restrictions that violate independent principles of justice. This would tend to suggest, at least, that there is no coherent ideal of equality of resources, or that the ideal is not politically attractive after all. We might discover, on the contrary, less comprehensive gaps or defects in the idea. Suppose, for example, that the design for the auction we develop does not uniquely determine a particular distribution, even given a stipulated set of initial resources and a stipulated population with fixed interests and ambitions, but instead capable of producing significantly different outcomes depending on the order of decisions, arbitrary choices about the composition of the initial list of options, or other contingencies. We might conclude that the ideal of equality of resources embraces a variety of distributions, each of which satisfies the ideal, and that the ideal is therefore partially indeterminate. This would show limitations on the power of the ideal to discriminate between certain contributions, but it would not for that reason show that the ideal is either incoherent or practically impotent. So it is worth trying to develop the idea of an equal action as a test of the theoretical standing and power of the political ideal. Second, a fully developed description of an equal action, adequate for a more complex society, might provide a standard for judging institutions and distributions in the real world. Of course, no complex, organic society would have, in its history, anything remotely comparable to an equal action. But we can nevertheless ask for any actual distribution whether it falls within the class of distributions that might have been produced by such an auction, a very defensible description of initial resources, or if it does not, how far it differs from or falls short of the closest distribution within this class. The device of the auction might provide, in other words, a standard for judging how far an actual distribution, however it has been achieved, approaches equality of resources at any particular time. Third, the device might be useful in the design of actual political institutions. Under certain, perhaps very limited circumstances, when the conditions for an equal auction are at least roughly met, then an actual auction might be the best means of reaching or preserving equality of resources in the real world. This will be true particularly when the results of such an auction are antecedently indeterminate in the way just described, so that any results the auction reaches will respect equality of resources, even though it is not known in advance which results would be reached. In such a case, it may be fairer to conduct an actual auction than to choose, through some other political means, one rather than another of the results that an auction might produce. Even in such a case, it will rarely be possible or desirable to conduct an actual auction in the design our theoretical investigations recommend. But it may be possible to design an auction surrogate, an economic or political institution having sufficient of the characteristics of a theoretical equal auction, that the arguments of fairness recommending an actual auction, were it feasible, also recommend the surrogate. The economic markets of many countries can be interpreted, even as they stand, as forms of auctions. So too can many forms of democratic political process. Once we have developed a satisfactory model of an actual auction, to the extent we can use that model to test these institutions and reform them to bring them closer to the model. Nevertheless, our project is in the main, in the discussion here, entirely theoretical. Our interest is primarily in the design of an ideal and of a device to picture that ideal and test its coherence, completeness, and appeal. We shall therefore ignore practical difficulties, like problems of gathering information, that do not impeach these theoretical goals, and also make simplifying counterfactual assumptions that do not subvert them. But we should try to notice which simplifications we are making, because they will be of importance, particularly as to the third and most practical application of our projects, at any later stage, at which we consider second best compromises of our ideal in the real world. 3. Luck and insurance. If the auction is successful as described, then equality of resources holds for the moment among the immigrants. But perhaps only for the moment, because if they are left alone, once the auction is completed, to produce and trade as they wish, then the envy test will shortly fail. Some may be more skillful than others at producing what others want and will trade to get. Some may like to work, or to work in a way that will produce more to trade, while others may like not to work or prefer to work at what will bring them less. Some will stay healthy while others fall sick, or lightning will strike the farms of others but avoid theirs. For any of these and dozens of other reasons, some people will prefer the bundle others have in, say, 5 years, to their own. We must ask whether, or rather how far, such developments are consistent with equality of resources, and I shall begin by considering the character and the impact of luck on the immigrants' post-auction fortunes. I shall distinguish, at least for the moment, between two kinds of luck. Option luck is a matter of how deliberate and calculated gambles turn out, whether someone gains or loses through accepting an isolated risk he or she should have anticipated and might have declined. Brute, ah oui. Brute luck is a matter of how risks fall out that are not, in that sense, deliberate gambles. If I buy a stock on the exchange that rises, then my option luck is good. If I am hit by a falling meteorite whose course could not have been predicted, then my bad luck is brute, even though I could have moved just before it struck if I had had any reason to know where it would strike. Obviously, the difference between these two forms of luck can be represented as a matter of degree, and we may be uncertain how to describe a particular piece of bad luck. If someone develops cancer in the course of a normal life, and there is no particular decision to which we can point as a gamble risking the disease, then we will say that he has suffered brute bad luck. But if he smoked cigarettes heavily, then we may prefer to say that he took an unsuccessful gamble. Insurance, so far as it is available, provides a link between brute and option luck because the decision to buy or reject catastrophe insurance is a calculated gamble. Of course, insurance does not erase the distinction. Someone who buys medical insurance and is hit by an unexpected meteorite still suffers brute bad luck, because he is worse off than if he had bought insurance and not needed it. But he has had better option luck than if he had not bought the insurance, because his situation is better in virtue of his not having run the gamble of refusing to insure. It is consistent with equality of resources that people should have different income or wealth in virtue of different. Now, is it consistent with equality of resources that people should have different income or wealth in virtue of differing option luck? Suppose some of the immigrants plant valuable but risky crops while others play it safer, and that some of the former buy insurance against uncongenial weather while others do not. Skill will play a part in determining which of these various programs succeed, of course, and we shall consider the problems this raises later. But option luck will also play a part. Does its role threaten or invade equality of resources? Consider, first, the differences in wealth between those who play it safe and those who gamble and succeed. Some people enjoy while others hate risks, but this particular difference in personality is comprehended in a more general difference between the kinds of life that different people wish to lead. The life chosen by someone who gambles contains as an element the factor of risk. Someone who chooses not to gamble has decided that he prefers a safer life. We have already decided that people should pay the price of the life they have decided to lead, measured in what others give up in order that they can do so. That was the point of the auction as a device to establish an initial equality of resources. But the price of a safer life, measured in this way, is precisely foregoing any chance of the gains whose prospect induces others to gamble. So we have no reason to object, against the background of our earlier decisions, to a result in which those who decline to gamble have less than some of those who do not. Oops. But we must also compare the situation of those who gamble and win with that of those who gamble and lose. We cannot say that the latter have chosen a different life and must sacrifice gains accordingly, for they have chosen the same lives as those who won. But we can say that the possibility of loss was part of the life they choose, that it was the fair price of the possibility of gain. For we might have designed our initial auctions so that people could purchase, for example, lottery tickets with their clamshells. But the price of those tickets would have been some amount of other resources, fixed by the odds and the gambling preferences of others, that the shells would otherwise have bought, and which will be wholly forgone if the ticket does not win. The same point can be made by considering the arguments for redistribution from winners to losers after the event. If winners were made to share their winnings with losers, then no one would gamble as individuals, and the kind of life preferred by both those who in the end win and those who lose would be unavailable. Of course, it is not a good argument against someone who urges redistribution in order to achieve equality of resources that redistribution would make some forms of life less attractive or even impossible. For the demands of equality we assume in this chapter are prior to other desiderata, including variety in the kinds of life available to people. Equality will in any case make certain kinds of lives, a life of economic and political domination for others, for example, impossible. In the present case, however, the difference is apparent, for the effect of redistribution from winners to losers in gambles would be to deprive both of lives they prefer, which indicates not simply that this would produce an unwanted curtailment of available forms of life, but that it would deprive them of an equal voice in the construction of lots to be auctioned, like the man who hated both plover's eggs and claret but was confronted only with bundles of both. Winners and losers all wanted gambles to be in the mix, either originally or as represented by resources with which they can take risks later, and the chance of losing is the correct price, measured on the metric we have been using, of a life that includes gambles with a chance of gain. We may, of course, have special reasons for forbidding certain forms of gambles. We may have paternalistic reasons for limiting how much an individual may risk, for example. We may also have reasons based in a theory of political equality for forbidding someone to gamble with his freedom or his religious or political rights. The present point is more limited. We have no general reason for forbidding gambles altogether in the bare fact that in the event winners will control more resources than losers, any more than in the fact that winners will have more than those who do not gamble. Our initial principle, that equality of resources requires that people pay the true cost of the lives they lead, warrants rather than condemns these differences. We may, if we wish, adjust our envy test to record that conclusion. We may say that in computing the extent of someone's resources over his life, for the purpose of asking whether anyone else envies those resources, any resources gained through a successful gamble should be represented by the opportunity to take the gamble at the odds in force, and comparable adjustments made to the resources of those who have lost through gambles. The main point of this artificial construction of the envy test, however, would be to remind us that the argument in favor of allowing differences Allô? Oui? Mhm. Oui, oui, bien sûr. Oui. Ah bah demain oui. Alors la seule chose c'est que j'ai 4 heures, mais ça normalement je pense que c'était indiqué dans mon CV, j'ai 4 heures certaines à Georges Leven l'année prochaine. Et ouais. Ouais, ça serait bien. Et puis aussi il y a le pardon, l'Institut Charlemagne, enfin l'Institut du Marais Charlemagne-Paulès, que j'ai rencontré aussi, mais ils pourront pas me dire avant la dernière semaine de l'été finalement, et donc voilà, ça c'est pas sûr non plus. Donc oui, je peux rencontrer demain. Mhm. À 11 heures c'est bien, ouais, plutôt l'après-midi. Merci. Mhm. D'accord, trop bien. Merci. Ah ouais. À demain. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Excusez-moi, je viens d'avoir une très bonne nouvelle. Geoffrey, est-ce que c'est toi l'unique personne qui était sur mon live YouTube? Ou qui y est actuellement? Excusez-moi, hein, si vous n'êtes pas Geoffrey, je viens d'avoir une très très bonne nouvelle. Donc, pardonnez-moi 5 secondes. Pas du tout. Ouais, donc excusez-moi 5 secondes. Hein. Je vais peut-être être prof au lycée EIB étoile, je suis trop contente en fait. Lycée international bilingue, bien sûr que je veux en fait. Heu, il y a le lycée EIB étoile qui vient de m'appeler, j'ai rendez-vous avec le directeur demain à 14h. Ils ont besoin d'un complément d'heure.
Quand je rentre de course. Ah génial, trop bien.
Je suis trop contente, c'est un bon lycée. Je vois que c'est un lycée international bilingue quand même.
Tu vois que ça va le faire tout ça. Moi je suis trop content. Je te fais plein de gros bisous.
Et tu dois t'entendre toi-même en live. Parce que tu es seule là, actuellement sur mon live. Non mais je suis trop contente en fait. On va pouvoir parler en direct. Attends, j'écoute ton dernier mot.
Moi aussi je suis trop content mon cœur.
Ah d'accord. Ouais, du coup c'est un bon lycée? C'est une question, hein. Et ce serait trop cool, wesh. Bah, la question c'était est-ce que c'est un bon lycée? Je vais demander à ChatGPT aussi sinon. Trop contente! C'est un peu loin de chez moi, c'est ça qui est dommage. 100% au bac avec 98% de mention, c'est génial. Ah oui, OK, taux de réussite au bac exceptionnel. considéré comme un très bon établissement, notamment grâce à ses résultats académiques et son orientation internationale. Classement solide 27e du secteur privé à Paris et 70e national. Il figure aussi dans le top 10 boulonnais, 7e sur 108, avec un encadrement très favorable, un prof pour 4 élèves. Un prof pour 4 élèves? Des classes de 4? Formation bilingue IB haut de gamme, cours intensifs en anglais, 25% du temps scolaire, section européenne, anglaise et IB depuis 2023. Insertion en études supérieures, une proportion significative d'élèves intègrent des classes prépa, grandes écoles ou universités prestigieuses en France et à l'international. McGill, LSE, UCL, EPFL, point amélioré. Logistique et infrastructure. Certains témoignages parlent de dispersion des locaux, de manque de cantines et de salles de sport, qualité variable de l'administration et des enseignants. Certains parents et élèves soulignent un manque de rigueur ou de suivi et le recours fréquent à des cours particuliers coûteux. Témoignages divergents, extrêmement injustes dans leur notation, impossible d'atteindre un niveau bien ou très bien sans des cours particuliers, oui, vous êtes nuls quoi, c'est tout. Professeur dévoué, excellente expérience à tous les niveaux. Verdict, le lycée EIB étoile est fortement recommandé si vous recherchez une solide préparation au baccalauréat avec un excellent taux de réussite et de mention, un environnement bilingue international, IB section européenne OIB, un accompagnement vers des études sélectives en France ou à l'étranger. Cependant, il faudra prendre en compte l'absence de cantine et d'équipement sur site, être vigilant sur les frais supplémentaires éventuels, cours particuliers. Ah oui, donc là-bas, ils proposent des cours particuliers. Donc je serais peut-être bien payée. Visiter le lycée pour évaluer l'ambiance, les installations et échanger avec des parents élèves. Conseil, visiter les locaux pour vérifier la répartition spatiale, l'accessibilité des salles de sport et la vie quotidienne. Rencontrer l'équipe pédagogique et d'orientation pour discuter de votre projet du suivi personnalisé. Échanger avec des familles actuelles pour avoir des retours directs sur la réalité du quotidien. En résumé, le lycée EIB Étoile offre une excellente performance académique et un cadre bilingue international riche, mais présente quelques limites en logistique et rigueur administrative. Une visite et discussion directe vous permettront de voir si l'établissement correspond bien à vos attentes. Et comment c'est une moyenne d'un prof pour 4 élèves? Je comprends pas pourquoi un prof pour un prof pour 4 élèves. Elle avait raison, ma maman. Ouais, tu vas voir qu'ils vont tous t'appeler avant la rentrée. Elle a toujours raison, maman, de toute façon. C'est pour ça que c'est une maman. Maman, si tu m'entends. Oh, j'en étais où, moi, avec tout ça? We may, if we wish, adjust our envy test to record that conclusion. We may say that in computing the extent of someone's resources over his life, for the purpose of asking whether anyone else envies those resources, any resources gained through a successful gamble should be represented by the opportunity to take the gamble at the odds and force, and comparable adjustments made to the resources of those who have lost through gambles. The main point of this artificial construction of the envy test, however, would be to remind us that the argument in favor of allowing differences in option luck to affect income and wealth assumes that everyone has in principle the same gambles available to him. Someone who never had the opportunity to run a similar risk and would have taken the opportunity had it been available will still envy some of those who did have it. Nor does the argument yet confront the case of brute bad luck. If two people lead roughly the same lives, but one goes suddenly blind, then we cannot explain the resulting differences in their incomes either by saying that one took risks that the other chose not to take, or that we could not redistribute without denying both the lives they prefer. For the accident has, we assume, nothing to do with choices in the pertinent sense. It is not necessary to the life either that has chosen that he run the risk of going blind without redistribution of funds from the other. This is a fortiori so if one is born blind and the other sighted. But the possibility of insurance provides, as I suggested, a link between the two kinds of luck. For suppose insurance against blindness is available in the initial auction at whatever level of coverage the policyholder chooses to buy. And also suppose that two-sided people have, at the time of the auction, equal chance of suffering an accident that will blind them and know that they have. Now, if one chooses to spend part of his initial resources for such insurance and the other does not, or if one buys more coverage than the other, then this difference will reflect their different opinions about the relative value of different forms or components of their prospective lives. C'est quoi la private joke? It may reflect the fact that one puts more value on sight than the other, or differently, that one would count monetary compensation for the loss of his sight as worthless in the face of such a tragedy, while the other, more practical, would fix his mind on the aids and special training that such money might buy, or simply that one minds or values risk differently from the other, and would, for example, rather try for a brilliant life that would collapse under catastrophe than a life guarded at the cost of resources necessary to make it brilliant. Je comprends pas c'est quoi la private joke. But in any case, the bare idea of equality of resources, apart from any paternalistic conditions, would not argue for redistribution from the person who had insured to the person who had not if, horribly, they were both blinded in the same accident. Il faut mettre des étoiles s'il y a des mots vulgaires. Pour que ce soit pas supprimé. For the availability of insurance would mean that, though both had had brute bad luck, the difference between them was a matter of option luck, and the arguments we entertained against disturbing the results of option luck under conditions of equal antecedent risk hold here as well. Ah! But then the... Ah, c'est EIB étoile, je pense. But then the situation cannot be different if the person who decided not to insure is the only one to be blinded. For once again, the difference is difference in option luck against the background of equal opportunity to insure or not. If neither had been blinded, the man who had insured against blindness would have been the loser. His option luck would have been bad, though it seems bizarre to put it this way, because he spent resources that, as things turned out, would have been better spent otherwise. But he would have no claim, in that event, from the man who did not insure and also survived unhurt. Merci. Ah oui, c'est l'heure de manger. La dame, elle s'appelle Simone Chong. La secrétaire. Donc, ouais. J'arrive. Juste 2 secondes, je confirme le rendez-vous. Oh bah, il n'y a plus personne. Bien. Donc, so if the condition just stated were met, if everyone had an equal risk of suffering some catastrophe that would leave him or her handicapped, and everyone knew roughly what the odds were and had ample opportunity to insure, then handicaps would pose no special problem for equality of resources. But of course that condition is not met. Some people are born with handicaps or develop them before they have either sufficient knowledge or funds to insure on their own behalf. They cannot buy insurance after the event, even handicaps that develop later in life, against which people do have the opportunity to insure, are not randomly distributed through the population, but follow genetic tracks so that sophisticated insurers would charge some people higher premiums for the same coverage before the event. Nevertheless, the idea of a market in insurance provides a counterfactual guide through which equality of resources might face the problem of handicaps in the real world. Suppose we can make sense of and even give a rough answer to the following question. If, contrary to fact, everyone had at the appropriate age the same risk of developing physical or mental handicaps in the future, which assumes that no one has developed these yet, but the total number of handicaps remained what it is, how much insurance coverage against these handicaps would the average member of the community purchase? We might then say that, but for uninsurable brute luck that has altered these equal odds, the average person would have purchased insurance at that level and compensates those who do develop handicaps accordingly out of some fund collected by taxation or other compulsory process but designed to match the fund that would have been provided through premiums if the odds had been equal. Those who develop handicaps will then have more resources at their command than others, but the extent of their extra resources will be fixed by the market decisions that people would supposedly have made if circumstances had been more equal than they are. Of course, this argument does involve the fictitious assumption that everyone who suffers handicaps would have bought the average amount of insurance, and we may wish to refine the argument and the strategies so that no longer holds. The averaging assumption is a simplifying assumption only, made to provide a result in the absence of the detailed, and perhaps for reasons described in the text, indeterminate information that would enable us to decide how much each handicapped person would have purchased in the hypothetical market. If we had such full information, so that we could tailor compensation to what a particular individual in fact would have bought, the accuracy of the program would be improved, but in the absence of such information, averaging is second best, or in any case better than nothing. But it does not seem an unreasonable assumption for this purpose as it stands. Can we answer the counterfactual question with sufficient confidence to develop a program of compensation of that sort? We face a threshold difficulty of some importance. People can decide how much of their resources to devote to insurance against a particular catastrophe only with some idea of the life they hope to lead, because only then can they decide how serious a particular catastrophe would be, how far additional resources would alleviate the tragedy, and so forth. But people who are born with a particular handicap or who develop one in childhood will of course take that circumstance into account in the plans they make. So in order to decide how much insurance such a person would have bought without the handicap, we must decide what sort of life he would have planned in that case. There may be no answer, even in principle, to that question. We do not need, however, to make counterfactual judgments that are so personalized as to embarrass us for that reason. Even if people did all have equal risk of all catastrophes, and evaluated the value and importance of insurance differently entirely as a result of their different ambitions and plans, the insurance market would nevertheless be structured through categories designating the risks against which most people would insure in a general way. After all, Risks of most catastrophes are now regarded by the actual insurance market as randomly distributed, and so we might follow actual insurance practice, modified to remove the discriminations insurers make when they know that one group is more likely, perhaps for genetic reasons, to suffer a particular kind of brute bad luck. It would make sense to suppose, for example, that most people would make roughly the same assessment of the value of insurance against general handicaps, such as blindness or the loss of a limb, that affect a wide spectrum of different sorts of lives. We might look to the actual market to discover the likelihood and the contours of more specialized insurance we might decide to use in more complex schemes, like the insurance of musicians against damage to their hands. We would, in any case, pay great attention to matters of technology and be ready to adjust our sums as technology changed. People purchase insurance against catastrophes, for example, against a background of assumptions about the remedial medical technology or special training or mechanical aids that are in fact available and about the cost of these remedies. People would seek insurance at a higher level against blindness, for example, if the increased recovery would enable them to purchase a newly discovered sight substitute technology, but they would if that increased recovery simply swelled a bank account they could not, in any case, use with much satisfaction. Of course, any judgments that the officials of a community might make about the structure of the hypothetical insurance market would be speculative and open to a variety of objections. But there is no reason to think, certainly in advance, that a practice of compensating the handicapped on the basis of such speculation would be worse, in principle, than the alternatives, and it would have the merit of aiming in the direction of the theoretical solution most congenial to equality of resources. We might we might now remind ourselves of what these alternatives are. I said in chapter 1 that the regime of equality of welfare, contrary to initial impressions, does a poor job of either explaining or guiding our impulse to compensate the severely handicapped with extra resources. It provides, in particular, no upper bound to compensation so long as any further payment would improve the welfare of the wretched. But this is not, as it might seem, generous, because it leaves the standard for actual compensation to the politics of selfishness broken by sympathy, politics that we know will supply less than any defensible hypothetical insurance market would offer. Consider another approach to the problem of handicaps under equality of resources. Suppose we say that any person's physical and mental powers must count as part of his resources, so that someone who is born handicapped starts with less by way of resources now with that, and should be allowed to catch up by way of transfer payments before what remains is auctioned off in any equal market. Excuse-moi, ça me gratte la jambe. Voilà. People's powers are indeed resources because they are used, together with material resources, in making something valuable out of one's life. Physical powers are resources for that purpose in the way that aspects of one's personality, like one's conception of what is valuable in life, are not. Nevertheless, the suggestion that a design of equality of resources should provide for an initial compensation to alleviate differences in physical or mental resources is troublesome in a variety of ways. It requires, for example, some standard of normal powers to serve as the benchmark for compensation. The hypothetical insurance approach does not require any stipulation of normal powers because it allows the hypothetical market to determine which infirmities are compensable. But whose powers should be taken as normal for this purpose? It suffers, moreover, from the same defect as the parallel recommendation under equality of welfare. In fact, no amount of initial compensation could make someone born blind or mentally incompetent equal in physical or mental resources with someone taken to be normal in these ways. So the argument provides no upper bound to initial compensation, but must leave this to a political compromise likely to be less generous, again, than what the hypothetical insurance market would command. Quite apart from these practical and theoretical inadequacies, the suggestion is troublesome for another reason. Though powers are resources, they should not be considered resources whose ownership is to be determined through politics in accordance with some interpretation of equality of resources. They are not, that is, resources for the theory of equality in exactly the sense in which ordinary material resources are. They cannot be manipulated or transferred, even so far as technology might permit. So in this way it misdescribes the problem of handicaps to say that equality of resources must strive to make people equal in physical and mental constitution so far as this is possible. The problem is rather one of determining how far the ownership of independent material resources should be affected by differences that exist in physical and mental powers, and the response of our theory would speak in that vocabulary. It might be wise, if for no other reason than a convenient summary of the argument from time to time, to bring our story of the immigrants up to date. By way of supplement to the auction, they now establish a hypothetical insurance market that they effectuate through compulsory insurance at a fixed premium for everyone on the basis of speculations about what the average immigrant would have purchased by way of insurance had antecedent risk of various handicaps being equal. We chose for them, that is, one of the simpler possible forms of instituting the hypothetical insurance market. We shall see when we discuss the problem of skills that they might well choose a more complex scheme of the sort discussed there. But now a question arises: does this decision place too much weight on the distinction between handicaps, which the immigrants treat in this compensatory way, and on accidents touching preferences and ambitions, like the accidents of what material resources are in fact available and of how many other people share a particular person's taste? The latter will also affect welfare, but they are not matters for compensation under our scheme. Would it now be fair to treat as handicaps eccentric tastes, or tastes that are expensive or impossible to satisfy because of scarcity of some good that might have been common? We might compensate those who have these tastes by supposing that everyone had an equal chance of being in that position, and then establishing a hypothetical insurance market against that possibility. A short answer is available. Someone who is born with a serious handicap faces his life with what we concede to be fewer resources, just on that account, than others do. This circumstance justifies compensation under a scheme devoted to equality of resources, and though the hypothetical insurance market does not right the balance, nothing can, it seeks to remedy one aspect of the resulting unfairness. But we cannot say that the person whose tastes are expensive, for whatever reason, therefore has fewer resources at his command. For we cannot state, without falling back on some version of equality of welfare, what equality in the distribution of tastes and preferences would be. Why is there less equality of resources when someone has an eccentric taste that makes goods cheaper for others than when he shares a popular taste and so makes goods more expensive for them? The auction, bringing to bear information about the resources that actually exist and the competing preferences actually in play, is the only true measure of whether any particular person commands equal resources. If the auction has in fact been an equal auction, when the man of eccentric tastes has no less than equal material resources, and the argument that justifies a compensatory hypothetical auction in the case of handicaps has no occasion even to begin. It is true that this argument produces a certain view of the distinction between a person and his circumstances, and assigns his tastes and ambitions to his person, and his physical and mental powers to his circumstances. That is the view of a person I sketched in the introductory section, of someone who forms his ambitions with a sense of their cost to others, against some presumed initial equality of economic power, and though this is different from the picture assumed by equality of welfare, it is a picture at the center of equality of resources. In one way, however, my argument might well be thought to overstate the distinction between handicaps and at least certain sorts of what are often considered preferences. Suppose someone finds he has a craving or obsession or lust or, in the words of an earlier psychology, a drive that he wishes he did not have because it interferes with what he wants to do with his life and offers him frustration or even pain if it is not satisfied. This might indeed be some feature of his physical needs that other people would not consider a handicap at all. For example, a generous appetite for sex. But it is a preference, if that is the right word, that he does not want, and it makes perfect sense to say that he would be better off without it. For some people, these unwanted tastes include tastes they have, perhaps unwittingly, themselves cultivated, such as a taste for a particular sport or for music of a sort difficult to obtain. They regret that they have these tastes, and believe they would be better off without them, but nevertheless find it painful to ignore them. These tastes are handicaps. Though for other people they are rather an essential part of what gives value to their lives. Now these cases do not present, for particular people, borderline cases between ambitions and handicaps, though no doubt other sorts of borderline cases could be found. The distinction required by equality of resources is the distinction between those beliefs and attitudes that define what a successful life would be like, which the ideal assigns to the person, and those features of body or mind or personality which provide means or impediments to that success, which the ideal assigns to the person's circumstances. Those who see their sexual desires or their taste for opera as unwanted disadvantages will class these features of their body or mind or personality firmly as the latter. These are, for them, handicaps, and are therefore suitable for the regime proposed for handicaps generally. We may imagine that everyone has an equal chance of acquiring such a craving by accident. Of course, for each person, the content of a craving that would have that consequence would be different. We are supposing here not the risk of any particular craving, but the risk of whatever craving would interfere with set goals in that way. We may then ask, with as much or as little intelligibility as in the case of blindness, whether people generally would purchase insurance against that risk, and if so, at what premium and what level of coverage. It seems unlikely that many people would purchase such insurance at the rates of premium likely to govern if they sought in, except in the case of cravings so severe and disabling as to fall under the category of mental disease, but that is a different matter. The important point, presently, is that the idea of an insurance market is available here, because we can imagine people who have such a craving not having it, without thereby imagining them to have a different conception of what they want from life than what in fact they do want. So the idea of the imaginary insurance action provides at once a device for identifying cravings and distinguishing them from positive features of personality, and also for bringing these cravings within the general regime designed for handicaps. Et la partie 4, Labor and Wages, on verra plus tard. Wesh. Voilà. À toutes.